Fort Harper stretched under the pale wash of floodlights like a miniature city, tents lining the perimeter like sentinels, engines idling, soldiers moving with rehearsed precision. Even from a distance, the base hummed with tension, a controlled chaos that was both intimidating and mesmerizing. Airplanes and helicopters occasionally broke the eerie quiet with low, powerful roars, reminding everyone that at any moment a drill could become a real-life nightmare. In the middle of all this, Lieutenant Commander Alina Brooks stood alone near the edge of the parade ground, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning the upcoming inspection schedule. Her posture was precise, every movement deliberate. She wasn't just a decorated officer. She was a strategist who had spent 15 years training for moments where seconds meant life or death. And yet, tonight, there was a weight she couldn't shake, a premonition that something in the coming hours would test her in ways no training could prepare her for. For weeks, whispers had swirled about a new operations commander, someone coming with a reputation that preceded him. The kind of man who didn't just lead but dominated through fear and intimidation. Alina had heard rumors of his previous postings, decorated SEAL, combat hero, and according to some reports, a volatile temper that had left subordinate officers walking on eggshells. But she didn't dwell on gossip. Her focus was discipline, readiness, and protocol. The night air was thick, scented with diesel, the metallic tang of rain-soaked earth, and the faint burn of jet fuel. Alina took a deep breath, adjusting the collar of her uniform. She could feel the tension in the air, a collective anticipation from over 1,000 soldiers scattered across the base. Something or someone was coming that would set all of it into motion. And then the helicopter appeared, cutting across the night sky. Its searchlights swept over the parade ground, momentarily blinding anyone who dared look up. The hum of its engines crescendoed, drowning out every other sound. Soldiers instinctively snapped to attention, the ones closest to the landing zone gripping their weapons tighter. When the ramp lowered, a figure descended, Commander Trent Hale. Alina had heard his name. She knew the stories, but nothing in the briefings or intelligence files could have prepared anyone for the presence of a man who walked with the kind of confidence that demanded attention, whose gaze seemed to dissect everything and everyone in sight. Boots thudded against the tarmac, metals gleaming under the artificial lights. His eyes scanned the formation until they landed on her. A smirk played across his lips, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a jolt through her spine. He was trouble in human form, and for some reason he seemed to have chosen her as his first target. The rest of the night passed in a blur of formalities and briefings. Hale inspected the base, barked at lower-ranking officers, and contradicted routine procedures with casual arrogance. Alina kept her eyes on him, watching his interactions, noting the subtle signs of an explosive temper. The way he tightened his jaw, the quick flare of nostrils when a sergeant spoke out of turn, the almost imperceptible twitch in his right hand. She tried to focus on the drill preparation. The schedule had to be flawless. The international observers were arriving in less than 12 hours, and over 1,000 soldiers would be on parade. But her mind kept returning to him and the way he looked at her, not just assessing but testing. By midnight, most officers had retreated to their quarters. The base quieted, engines idling softly like purring beasts. Alina remained in her office, reviewing tactical maps and checking personnel assignments. The storm of anticipation was heavy in her chest, a tension she hadn't felt in years. Something told her that by morning, she wouldn't just be dealing with routine inspections or drills. Something far bigger and more dangerous was about to unfold. Suddenly her phone buzzed, a message from a fellow officer. "Hale is not what he seems, be careful." She didn't reply, she didn't need to, she already knew. Sleep came fitfully, shallow and fragmented. Dreams were punctuated with flashes of violence, a raised hand, the blur of a strike, a crowd of soldiers frozen in shock. She woke before dawn, heart racing, a cold sweat clinging to her uniform. She dressed quickly, checking her gear. Every detail had to be perfect, every precaution accounted for. The sun began to rise, casting a pale orange glow over the base. Soldiers began assembling on the parade ground, helmets glinting, boots scuffing the wet concrete. Alina walked out, clipboard in hand, her boots echoing against the pavement. The formation stretched out like a living grid, every soldier holding a silent, tense anticipation in their stance. And then, as if on cue, Hale appeared. He moved with the fluidity of someone accustomed to command, stepping past every officer, ignoring protocol. He didn't acknowledge anyone. He didn't even glance at the other commanders. His eyes were locked on Alina, sharp, calculating, and strangely predatory. The air seemed to change. The morning breeze stilled. Even the chirping of birds seemed to fade under the intensity of his gaze. Soldiers noticed. A few exchanged nervous glances. Most didn't dare speak. Alina kept walking, posture straight, stride even. She met his gaze briefly, unwavering. Hale smirked again, almost imperceptibly, but it was enough to make her blood run cold. Not because she feared him, she didn't, but because she understood instinctively that the confrontation ahead wasn't just professional, it was personal. As he stepped closer, she could see the subtle signs of tension. The way his fingers twitched, the slight flare of his nostrils, the tightening of his shoulders. Everything in his body language screamed unpredictability, and in front of 1,000 soldiers, this man could be dangerous. Then, in a whisper of movement that barely registered to anyone else, he brushed past her, just enough to make his presence felt, to test her. Alina stopped, slowly turning to face him fully. Her eyes narrowed. "Good morning, Commander," she said evenly. Her voice carried over the formation, calm, unshakable, but edged with steel. Hale tilted his head, studying her. "Don't forget who you're talking to," he said, low and dangerous. "I'm a Navy SEAL." Alina's lips quirked, not quite a smile. "Then act like one," she replied, steady as a rock. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Soldiers stiffened. Officers held their positions, eyes darting between the two. The tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife. And in that frozen instant, Alina realized that the events about to unfold would be remembered not just as another day in military life, but as a turning point, a moment when reputation, pride, and skill would collide in front of an audience of 1,000 witnesses. Hale's eyes narrowed. Something unspoken passed between them. Challenge, warning, threat, she couldn't be sure. The entire parade ground seemed to vibrate with unspoken anticipation. And then Hale stepped back, chest rising and falling, his smirk replaced by a thin, dangerous line. Alina exhaled slowly, gripping her clipboard tighter. She knew the day ahead would test everything, her training, her restraint, and perhaps even her life. Because by sunrise, the world would witness something no one could ever forget. Alina senses the storm, Hale's presence is a ticking fuse, and the soldiers are unknowingly on the edge of witnessing a confrontation that could change everything. The next morning promises chaos, confrontation, and a test of everything Alina stands for. The sun had barely broken over the horizon, but Fort Harper's parade ground was alive with activity. Over 1,000 soldiers stood at attention, uniforms immaculate, boots polished to mirror shine, eyes fixed straight ahead. The air smelled of dew, metal, and anticipation, carrying the weight of discipline that could turn into chaos in a heartbeat. At the center of it all, Lieutenant Commander Alina Brooks moved through the formation like a silent storm. Her steps were measured, her expression composed, but every fiber of her body was alert. Something about Commander Trent Hale unnerved her, not fear but recognition. She knew when someone was dangerous, and Hale wasn't just dangerous, he was unpredictable. Within moments of arriving, Hale began his inspection. Officers and sergeants watched nervously as he strode past the formations, eyes sharp, chest thrust forward, hands clasping the clipboard he hadn't even needed. Every movement was calculated to assert dominance, to remind everyone that, in his eyes, rank didn't matter. He did. Alina watched quietly, taking mental notes. He contradicted a first sergeant's report on parade protocol, dismissed a tactical recommendation from a junior officer, and barked at a logistics officer for improperly stacking supplies. The entire formation flinched at the echoes of his voice. And then he stopped. His gaze locked on her. The soldiers around them seemed to fade. Time slowed. Even the wind held its breath. Hale's smirk was almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of challenge, a silent assertion that he intended to break her. He stepped forward, past protocol, past every other officer, until he was standing directly in front of Alina. The murmurs across the parade ground died down. Even hardened soldiers couldn't look away. "You undermine me," Hale said, low and sharp, his eyes glinting with controlled aggression. "Protocol was followed," Alina replied evenly, unwavering, her voice slicing through the morning air. "Protocol is irrelevant when I command," he snapped, voice carrying across the formation. Alina didn't flinch. Her hands rested lightly on her hips, her stance firm. "Leadership is earned, Commander. Authority doesn't give someone the right to humiliate those under their command." Hale's eyes narrowed. "You think you're immune because of your rank. You think your little reputation shields you. Don't forget who you're talking to. I'm a Navy SEAL." Alina's gaze locked with his. She tilted her chin slightly. "Then act like one." The soldiers around them froze, witnessing a verbal clash that felt as dangerous as any physical confrontation. Some whispered to one another, barely containing awe. Others simply stared, unsure if they should intervene or stay rooted to the spot. Hale's jaw clenched, a vein pulsing at the side of his temple. "You're insolent," he spat, stepping closer. His proximity was a test, a challenge, a subtle threat. 1 inch closer and it would become physical. Alina didn't move back. She had been trained for this. 15 years of combat and survival didn't make someone invincible, it made them prepared. She assessed every micro-movement, the twitch of his fingers, the shifting of his weight, the faint tremor in his right hand. All signals pointed to one thing: escalation was inevitable. But she also saw another truth, a weakness that could be exploited. Hale relied on intimidation, on fear. Alina didn't fear him. That imbalance was dangerous for him and paradoxically gave her control. "Lieutenant Commander," Hale growled, his voice low, almost a snarl, "you will respect my authority." "Respect is not commanded, Commander," she replied. "It is earned, and you have yet to earn mine." A pause. The formation seemed to collectively exhale, as if holding its breath had become impossible. The tension was so thick soldiers reported afterward that the air itself felt electrified, charged with the potential for violence. Hale's hand twitched. His body leaned forward slightly, a subtle warning that he might strike. Alina's pulse quickened, not out of fear but calculation. She knew what she would do if he moved. Every reaction had been drilled, every reflex sharpened over years. But before he could act, a junior officer stepped in, clearing his throat. "Sir, the tactical formation is ready for review." Hale's glare sliced toward the officer, then back at Alina. For a moment his composure faltered, a glimpse of the man behind the mask of command. Alina caught it, nodding the brief flicker of doubt in his eyes before he masked it with a controlled smirk. "You will regret this," he whispered, directed at her alone. "Don't forget that, Lieutenant Commander." Alina didn't respond. Her face betrayed nothing. Her body language radiated calm. But inwardly her mind raced, preparing for what was coming. She knew that Hale's ego and pride were combustible, and that sooner or later this confrontation would become physical. The first sergeant approached, signaling that the formation was about to begin the inspection in earnest. Hale straightened, but the threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. Soldiers resumed their positions, but the tension was undiminished. Every pair of eyes in the formation tracked every movement between the two officers, sensing that this was not just a clash of authority, it was a collision of wills. As Hale walked past the parade formation, Alina followed, keeping pace, eyes never leaving him. She noticed the subtle signs, the slight stiffening of his shoulders, the controlled tension in his stride, the jaw that flexed as though anticipating resistance. These were indicators of someone trained for combat but blind to the reality that their opponent could be equally skilled. By mid-morning, the soldiers had been drilled, inspected, and repositioned multiple times. Hale's scrutiny was relentless, his verbal corrections sharp, and every officer under his command felt the weight of his presence like a physical force. Yet Alina moved with fluid grace, ensuring that every command, every adjustment, maintained protocol and discipline, all while subtly resisting his attempts to intimidate. The tension between them escalated quietly, invisible to some, but to those paying attention, it was like watching two predators circling. The difference was that one predator relied on rank and intimidation, while the other relied on experience, skill, and the calm precision honed in real combat. And then it happened. During a routine formation adjustment, Hale stepped too close, brushing against her shoulder deliberately, a move meant to provoke a reaction. Alina froze, assessing the microsecond it would take for him to escalate. The crowd of soldiers sensed it, whispering in anxious murmurs. "Lieutenant Commander," Hale hissed, voice low and menacing, "remember your place." Alina's pulse remained steady, her eyes locked with his, unwavering. "My place," she replied quietly, but so clearly that the nearest soldiers could hear, "is where I stand on the side of duty and discipline, not your ego." Hale's hand shot out, not striking but shoving, a test of strength and authority in front of over 1,000 soldiers. The formation flinched collectively. Gasps rippled through the rows of Marines, sailors, and officers. Some instinctively reached for their radios. Others simply stared, frozen, realizing that what they were witnessing was a confrontation that could spiral out of control. Alina didn't move back, not an inch. Her stance remained perfect, her breathing controlled, every muscle coiled, prepared for the moment when escalation would inevitably come. Hale's eyes widened, and for an instant there was a flicker of recognition, surprise, maybe even fear. Not because of what Alina might do, but because he had never encountered someone in his presence who would not flinch, who would not bow, who would not yield to intimidation. And then Hale's arm moved again, this time faster, more deliberate, aimed to humiliate. The crowd collectively held its breath. Soldiers gripped their rifles tighter. Officers exchanged anxious glances. Cameras from the observers' stands pivoted, capturing every micro-movement. In that heartbeat, Alina knew. The moment had come where she could no longer rely on words alone. The test was no longer verbal. It was physical, and every soldier on that parade ground would witness what happened next. Her mind raced, calculating angles, momentum, impact. Every reflex drilled into her over 15 years of combat sharpened like a blade. She didn't want this. She didn't crave confrontation. But she knew that failure to act now could lead to humiliation, or worse. And as Hale's hand swung closer, the formation held its breath, the air charged with anticipation, the soldiers unaware that what was about to unfold would become the talk of Fort Harper, and the military, for years to come. Hale's escalating aggression has crossed the line. Alina is prepared to respond, and the soldiers are frozen on the edge of witnessing a confrontation that could change everything. The next part will reveal the explosive moment when training, skill, and restraint collide with raw ego and unpredictability. The morning sun burned pale and harsh over Fort Harper, cutting through the mist that clung stubbornly to the parade ground. Over 1,000 soldiers stood in formation, their polished boots reflecting the early light like rows of steel. Officers and enlisted personnel alike held their posture with unyielding precision, yet the tension was palpable, like a coiled spring threatening to snap. At the center of this immense assembly, Lieutenant Commander Alina Brooks moved with controlled grace. Her eyes never left Commander Trent Hale, who now paced in front of her, chest forward, jaw tight, a storm barely contained behind his mettle and composure. Every movement he made was deliberate, designed to dominate, to intimidate, to remind everyone who held the real power. And in front of 1,000 witnesses, Alina knew the stakes had just escalated from professional tension to personal confrontation. Hale stopped suddenly, pivoting on his heel to face her directly. Soldiers instinctively shifted, sensing that the impending clash wasn't a matter of protocol, it was a collision of wills. "You're defiant," Hale said, his voice carrying over the formation like a whip crack. "I've commanded SEAL teams in the most dangerous theaters of combat, and you think you can, what, talk back?" Alina squared her shoulders. She didn't respond with aggression. Her voice was calm, precise, and cutting. "I'm not here to talk back, Commander. I'm here to uphold discipline, procedure, and the safety of the soldiers under my command. You should try it sometime." The crowd murmured faintly. Hale's eyes flickered, not out of doubt but irritation, something darker. A surge of dominance flared in him. He leaned in just slightly, a microaggression perfectly calculated to provoke, to intimidate. "You think you're untouchable because of your rank, because of your reputation, because of your years," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "But here's the truth, you're nothing in my presence, and soon everyone else will know it too." Alina's pulse remained steady. Her entire body was coiled, trained for scenarios like this. Years of hand-to-hand combat, years of surviving ambushes, firefights, and hostile takeovers had drilled reflexes and discipline into her muscle memory. She knew exactly how to react when provoked, but she also knew the line between restraint and escalation. Hale shifted closer. His hand brushed against her shoulder, not accidental, not friendly. The move was deliberate, meant to test her resolve, to remind her of his presence. The soldiers noticed. Some instinctively tightened their grip on their rifles. Others exchanged wary glances, sensing that what was unfolding was far beyond routine drill. Alina's eyes narrowed slightly. She didn't move back. Her stance remained perfect, grounded, balanced, controlled. Every microsecond of observation told her that Hale was preparing to cross a line. And then it happened. Hale's palm struck her cheek. It was swift, sharp, a push meant to humiliate, to provoke a reaction. Gasps spread across the formation. 1,000 soldiers froze, caught between disbelief and instinctive readiness. Some whispered, "Did he just?" while others stared wide-eyed at the spectacle. Alina's world went into hyperfocus. Not panic, not rage, focus, training, survival, every fiber of her being activated. She had been in real combat, in real danger where hesitation meant death. And now, in front of 1,000 witnesses, she faced a different kind of battlefield. A test of skill, restraint, and courage under pressure. Hale's eyes narrowed, expecting her to flinch, to stumble, to break. But she didn't. She barely moved, her stance coiled like a spring, ready to respond in the precise moment he overextended. The entire formation seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind stilled. Soldiers sensed that this was more than a simple disciplinary incident. It was a storm about to break. Hale's arm swung again, faster this time, aiming to assert control, to dominate her physically. But Alina anticipated it. Reflexively, she shifted her weight, pivoting her body in a controlled motion honed through years of training. Then, in a move so precise it looked effortless, she struck, not to harm but to neutralize. Hale stumbled backward, catching himself on the podium. The echo of impact rippled across the formation. Soldiers gasped audibly. Some instinctively ducked, unsure if this was sanctioned training or something far more dangerous. But Hale recovered quickly, a flash of fury igniting in his eyes. He lunged, misjudging the distance, and his momentum carried him slightly off balance. Alina stepped to the side, maintaining perfect form, keeping her defensive stance, ready to act again if necessary. The silence across the parade ground was deafening. No one moved, no one breathed loudly. Even the birds overhead seemed to pause, sensing the tension below. "Stop this," a voice shouted. A junior officer tried to intervene, but Hale waved him away, his rage barely contained. "You dare resist me," Hale shouted, voice cracking with a mix of anger and incredulity. "Do you have any idea who I am? I've killed men, led teams into hell, and you stand there like some kind of child." Alina's eyes locked on his. "And I've survived battles you couldn't imagine, and I'm still standing. That's the difference between words and action, Commander." Another pause, a deadly silence. Soldiers instinctively adjusted their stance, bracing for whatever might come next. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Hale's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the frustration of being outmaneuvered, outmatched, and humiliated in front of 1,000 soldiers. His ego, forged in years of combat and command, couldn't reconcile the fact that someone had not only resisted him, but had done so with precision and authority. He lunged again, a more violent swing this time, aiming for dominance, for control. Alina reacted instantly. Reflexes sharpened by 15 years of combat, years of training under extreme duress, kicked in. She sidestepped, deflected his momentum, and countered with a strike designed to neutralize rather than harm. Hale hit the ground hard. The echo of impact rolled across the formation like thunder. 1,000 soldiers froze. Some dropped to one knee instinctively. Others covered their mouths in shock. No one had expected this. No one had seen it coming. Alina stood over him, chest heaving slightly, eyes sharp, controlled. She hadn't intended to escalate further, but she had no choice. He had crossed a line that, in her experience, demanded immediate, decisive response. The crowd was silent. 1,000 pairs of eyes, wide with disbelief, focused on the moment frozen before them. Soldiers whispered to one another, trying to process the shock. Did she just knock him out? Hale's fingers twitched, his face contorted in a mix of anger and humiliation. He tried to rise, but the precision of Alina's strike, the control she maintained over the situation, kept him grounded. He was powerful, yes, a decorated SEAL, but he had underestimated her. And as he struggled, the entire base realized something critical. Alina Brooks was not a woman to be dominated. The silence was broken by the general's voice, carried over the formation. "Lieutenant Commander, report immediately to my office." The words cut through the shock, adding a new layer of tension. Soldiers exchanged glances. What had just happened was unprecedented, but what was about to happen next? That was a question no one dared answer aloud. Alina took a deep breath. She adjusted her uniform. She had followed protocol, defended herself, and maintained control. But she also knew the inquiry ahead could make or break her career. Every action would be scrutinized, every word examined. And yet, standing there with Hale on the ground, she felt a strange calm. She had done what needed to be done. She had held her ground. But the danger wasn't over. Hale's eyes flicked toward her, a silent promise of retribution. The formation sensed it. The tension surged anew. The soldiers knew that what they had just witnessed wasn't the conclusion, it was the beginning. Because tomorrow, the entire base, and perhaps the world, would remember this moment. A confrontation had erupted on the parade ground that would ripple through careers, reputations, and the lives of every soldier who had seen it. And in that tense, electric moment, Alina realized something terrifyingly clear. The real battle was only just beginning. Hale has been knocked down, but he's not defeated. The inquiry looms, careers hang in the balance, and soldiers are left wondering what comes next. Part 4 will explore the immediate fallout and the tension as the base reacts to an unprecedented event. The dust from Hale's fall still hung in the air like a tangible fog as the parade ground erupted into a mixture of stunned silence and murmured chaos. Over 1,000 soldiers froze, their polished boots rooted to the concrete, eyes wide with disbelief. Cameras from the international observers, stands swiveled, capturing the moment in crystal clarity, an unprecedented event that would echo across the military and beyond. Alina stood still, chest rising and falling, every muscle taut but controlled. Her training kept her grounded. 15 years of combat and conflict had taught her that moments like this were fleeting, dangerous, and decisive. She had defended herself, and yet she knew every eye was on her, and every soldier was now silently calculating what would happen next. Hale's face twisted with disbelief, anger, and something more primal, humiliation. His hand shot out to steady himself, but the impact had left him momentarily stunned. He was a decorated SEAL, a man used to commanding respect through fear, but in that instant the pedestal he had built for himself was cracking. "Get him up," Hale barked, his voice cracking under the weight of his fury. Several officers instinctively stepped forward, unsure whether to intervene or wait for orders. Soldiers in the front rows shifted uncomfortably, instinctively moving into defensive stances. The parade ground had become a tension-charged theater, a silent waiting game between controlled authority and explosive aggression. Alina, however, didn't move to strike again. She maintained her stance, defensive, not aggressive, aware that the optics of her next action could define her career. She had acted in self-defense. She had followed every protocol, every guideline drilled into her over years of training. But this was more than protocol now. This was survival under scrutiny, both from the soldiers present and from the thousands of unseen eyes that would later witness the footage. Hale pushed himself up, swearing under his breath. His face was flushed, and the slight tremor in his hands betrayed the loss of composure he rarely allowed anyone to see. For a man whose identity was bound to dominance and control, this was uncharted territory. "You," he started, his words choked with fury, "you will pay for this. Do you hear me? You." The formation collectively flinched at the force of his rage. Soldiers instinctively prepared to intervene, but Alina raised a hand slightly, a subtle command to maintain discipline. She wasn't done, not yet, but she was in control. And then a murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone had whispered, "Did she just knock out a commander?" The realization hung in the air like static. Over 1,000 soldiers, trained for discipline, formation, and control, were now witnesses to something unprecedented. A decorated SEAL, someone with authority, medals, and recognition, had been physically neutralized by a female officer standing in defense of her own integrity. Hale's eyes darted around, searching for support, for validation. Officers hesitated, unsure how to respond. The balance of power was off-kilter. The general of the base, previously watching from the command stand, finally spoke into his microphone. "Everyone hold position." The formation froze further, every movement sharpened, every breath held. Alina's heart beat steadily, not from fear, but from calculated awareness. She knew the moment she had been thrust into could either cement her reputation or destroy it. Every second that Hale remained unrestrained increased the risk, but hesitation would be worse. Hale regained partial composure and lurched forward, his intent clear. Another shove, another strike, another attempt to reclaim dominance in front of the soldiers. But this time, Alina acted preemptively. Years of training coalesced into fluid motion. She stepped aside, pivoted, and used a combination of leverage and controlled force to deflect him without unnecessary harm. Hale crashed to the ground again. This time, the impact was louder, more dramatic, and undeniably final. The echo rolled across the formation, bouncing off the concrete and metal, rattling soldiers' nerves. For a moment, nothing moved, nothing breathed. Soldiers stared, eyes wide, disbelief etched into every face. Observers and reporters gawked at their cameras, capturing the moment that would make headlines. Hale's pride had been shattered. His authority, publicly challenged, lay in tatters. And then he moved again. Not to stand, not to recover, but to seethe. His eyes, dark and molten, focused on Alina with a dangerous intensity. Rage fueled his every movement. He tried to rise, to regain composure, but each effort seemed only to expose the cracks in his control. Alina remained calm, maintaining perfect form. She did not attack. She did not escalate. Every action was measured, every breath controlled. This was more than a fight. It was a statement. Discipline versus ego, training versus arrogance, integrity versus unchecked aggression. Around the parade ground, whispers escalated into murmurs, murmurs into stunned chatter. Soldiers shared glances, some incredulous, some admiring. They knew what had happened wasn't just self-defense. It was courage under fire in a situation most would never face. And then the general's voice boomed again, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Lieutenant Commander Brooks, report immediately to my office." The words were sharp, deliberate, leaving no room for debate. Soldiers instinctively snapped to attention. Officers hesitated, unsure whether to intervene, whether to stop the sequence of events unfolding before them. Hale's face contorted with fury. "You will regret this," he shouted, but even his voice betrayed the hesitation in his mind. Something about Alina's stance, her composure, and the undeniable fact that he had been neutralized in front of the entire formation unsettled him. Alina exhaled, slowly, controlled. She adjusted her uniform, straightened her posture, and prepared to follow protocol to its letter. Every eye in the formation was on her. Every soldier was silently asking themselves, what happens next? Hale's breathing grew heavier, more erratic. His pride, his ego, his carefully constructed identity as a decorated SEAL and commanding officer had been publicly challenged, and it was not yet clear if he would respond with rage, shame, or retreat. The soldiers whispered again, some exchanging uneasy glances. The lesson was clear. Rank does not automatically confer respect. Discipline and integrity still mattered, and in this unprecedented moment, a single officer had reminded them all of that truth. Hale struggled to rise. Alina's eyes met his, unwavering. "Step aside," she said, her tone calm, precise. "We will follow procedure. You will be treated according to protocol. Nothing more, nothing less." For a heartbeat, the general and officers watched the exchange. The tension was so thick that it could almost be felt physically, a collective, suspended anticipation. Every soldier understood the stakes. A single misstep now could ignite chaos, not just between two officers, but across the entire formation. Hale finally straightened, chest heaving, hands trembling slightly. The smoldering rage in his eyes didn't dissipate, but he recognized something crucial. Alina Brooks had not only defended herself, she had controlled the situation, maintained order, and preserved discipline under the most intense, public scrutiny imaginable. But he didn't relent, far from it. His voice, low and dangerous, cut through the air. "This isn't over." The soldiers froze again. Even the general's stern expression betrayed the tension in the moment. Hale's threat hung over the formation, unspoken but understood. The confrontation wasn't finished, and the consequences of this incident were only beginning to unfold. Alina straightened, shoulders back, breathing steady. Her pulse was calm, mind sharp. She knew the next steps would define everything, her career, her reputation, and the respect of every soldier on that parade ground. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She would face whatever came next, prepared and unwavering. And in that suspended moment, as Hale glared and the formation held its collective breath, everyone understood something essential. The events at Fort Harper that morning were unprecedented, historic, and far from concluded. The storm had only begun. Hale has been knocked down twice, but his fury is far from spent. Alina has acted with precision and control, but the inquiry, the soldiers' reactions, and Hale's wrath all promise escalating tension in the next chapter. The base's command office felt colder than the morning parade ground, despite the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Air conditioning hummed softly, but the chill in the room was palpable, carrying the weight of consequence. Lieutenant Commander Alina Brooks stepped inside, posture impeccable, eyes sharp. Every inch of her demeanor radiated control, but inside, adrenaline still coursed through her veins. Commander Trent Hale had been escorted there moments before, bandaged, chest heaving, face flushed with anger and humiliation. He wasn't just a man upset about a shove or a defensive strike. He was a decorated SEAL, a commander whose identity was tied to domination, fear, and control. And that identity had been shattered in front of 1,000 witnesses. The general sat behind a large oak desk, his fingers steepled. The room was tense, the silence heavy, broken only by the distant murmur of base activity beyond the walls. Officers and a JAG lawyer stood at attention, ready to document every word, every action, every nuance. "Elena," the general said, voice steady but firm, "you have defended yourself in front of over 1,000 personnel, including international observers. That cannot be ignored. But you also struck a superior officer. That cannot be ignored either." "I understand, sir," Elena replied evenly, her voice calm despite the storm swirling inside. "I acted in accordance with self-defense regulations. Commander Hale physically assaulted me." The JAG lawyer raised an eyebrow. "You could have neutralized him without knocking him unconscious," he said. "The optics, Lieutenant Commander, are delicate." Elena didn't flinch. Her gaze was unwavering. "With respect, sir," she said, voice firm, "he was in motion, he was aggressive, and I had a responsibility to protect myself and maintain control over the situation in front of the formation. Hesitation could have escalated it further." The general nodded slowly, folding his hands on the desk. "We'll be conducting a full inquiry," he said. "Witness statements, footage, medical reports, every detail. You'll have to answer questions, Lieutenant Commander, and understand your career may hinge on the interpretation of your actions today." Elena inhaled, steady. 15 years in the Navy had taught her that stakes this high required clarity, focus, and composure. "Understood, sir," she said. "I will provide my statement truthfully and fully." Hale, seated across from her, clenched his fists. His eyes burned with fury. "You think this ends here?" he hissed, barely under his breath. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I am a SEAL. I am a commander. You've humiliated me in front of everyone. That will not stand." Elena met his gaze without hesitation. "Commander," she said evenly, "I don't intend to humiliate anyone. I only intend to defend myself. And you should know your reputation does not give you the right to assault another officer." Hale's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, muttering under his breath. He realized for the first time in years that someone had seen through his authority, his bluster, and his intimidation, and that someone had stood firm. The general interjected. "Enough. Hale, you will answer questions as part of the inquiry. Lieutenant Commander Brooks will do the same. Any further outbursts will be noted. Understood." Hale's glare could have cut steel. He gritted his teeth, but he nodded reluctantly. "Understood." The inquiry began immediately. Witnesses from the formation were called one by one, recounting what they had seen. Footage from multiple cameras was reviewed, capturing the movements, gestures, and body language of both parties. Statements were collected meticulously, each word analyzed for accuracy, consistency, and credibility. Soldiers who had witnessed the incident were nervous but forthcoming. "He struck first," one whispered to the recorder. "She didn't flinch, she just reacted. It was clean, professional." Another observer added, "I've never seen someone handle a situation like that in my life. Most would have panicked, but she stayed calm, kept control, and neutralized the threat without escalation." Hale's temper flared as witnesses spoke, but every outburst was carefully documented, each slip of anger undermining the carefully curated image of authority he had maintained for years. As the inquiry continued, Elena was called to provide her detailed account. She described the events with precision, recalling each micro-movement, each verbal exchange, every subtle sign of escalation. She spoke calmly, concisely, and without embellishment. "I did not intend to injure Commander Hale," she explained. "I intended to neutralize the immediate threat, prevent further escalation, and maintain the integrity of the formation. All actions were defensive, in accordance with training and Navy protocols." The room was silent for a moment. Hale shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His ego, carefully constructed over years of service, was unraveling before him. The witnesses' statements, the footage, and Alina's calm professionalism left little room for interpretation. But Hale wasn't finished. He leaned forward, voice low and dangerous. "This is career suicide for you, Brooks. Don't think for a second that this ends here. You may have neutralized me physically, but you've just made yourself a target." Alina's expression didn't change. Her composure was absolute. "If standing up for myself and following protocol makes me a target, so be it. But I will not compromise discipline, safety, or integrity." The general finally spoke again. "Alina, we will review all evidence. Hale, your actions have been noted. This inquiry will determine the outcome. But one thing is clear. The chain of command cannot be compromised by personal ego or unchecked aggression." Hale's face darkened, and he muttered under his breath something Alina couldn't hear, but the venom in his eyes was unmistakable. He had underestimated her, and now he would spend every moment plotting a way to reclaim control. Outside the office, soldiers whispered, trying to process what they had witnessed. The story spread quickly, from the formation to the barracks and soon across the base. Alina's peers were in awe, inspired by her poise, courage, and skill. But whispers of potential repercussions also spread. Not everyone saw her actions as justified. Alina stepped out of the office briefly, allowing herself a moment of reflection. Her heart still raced, but her mind was clear. She had acted decisively, defended herself, and upheld her principles. Yet she knew the inquiry was only the beginning. Hale was dangerous, not physically anymore perhaps, but politically, socially, and reputationally. He would exploit every opportunity to retaliate. Back in the office, the inquiry panel reconvened. New evidence had surfaced: Hale's past history, prior complaints filed by other female officers, reports that had been quietly buried over the years. The general reviewed the files carefully, his expression grave. "Alina," he said quietly, "these complaints, if verified, support your account and further demonstrate a pattern of behavior. But they must be corroborated, and the inquiry will handle that. Be prepared to testify fully and answer every question truthfully." Alina nodded. She had anticipated this. The reports confirmed what she had already suspected. Hale had a long history of intimidation, abuse of authority, and unchecked aggression, particularly toward women under his command. But having evidence didn't guarantee justice. The inquiry could still twist facts, and military politics could be ruthless. Hale, seated across the room, caught the exchange between Alina and the general. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. Not fear, not respect, but anger and calculation. He realized that Alina now held a quiet leverage over him, one he would not forget. As the inquiry continued into the afternoon, tension in the room escalated. Soldiers and officers exchanged glances, realizing that the incident at the parade ground was no ordinary confrontation. It had become a test of integrity, authority, and courage, one that would have lasting repercussions for both Alina and Hale. The general finally adjourned the session for the day. Alina rose, straightening her uniform, maintaining the calm exterior she had held throughout the inquiry. Soldiers outside gave her subtle nods of respect. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her message had already been sent. She would not be intimidated. But as she left the office, a junior officer approached, urgency in his step. "Ma'am, you need to get back to the parade ground," he said, voice low. "The soldiers, they're chanting your name. The footage is circulating and well, you need to see this." Alina's brow furrowed slightly. "Why now? The inquiry isn't finished." "They're not waiting, ma'am. They're inspired, and they want you to know it." A deep exhale left her lips. She had maintained composure, upheld protocol, and defended herself. But the full impact of her actions, the public recognition, the morale shift among the soldiers, the humiliation of Hale, was only beginning to unfold. As she made her way back to the parade ground, a sense of anticipation mixed with unease. She knew Hale would not accept defeat quietly. The storm was far from over, and she would have to navigate not just the inquiry, but the wrath of a man humiliated in front of 1,000 soldiers. And as the chants grew louder, echoing across the base, Alina realized something profound. Her actions had inspired respect, but they had also painted a target on her back. The coming days would test not just her skill and integrity, but her endurance, her patience, and her ability to stand unshaken in the face of retaliation. The line between victory and survival had been drawn, and everyone at Fort Harper knew it. The inquiry confirms Alina acted correctly, but Hale's wrath simmers. Soldiers are inspired, whispers of her courage spread, and the next phase of the confrontation, Hale's retaliation and the full fallout, is inevitable. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving Fort Harper bathed in the sterile glow of floodlights. Shadows stretched across the parade ground, and the base hummed with quiet tension. The day's events had left soldiers on edge, whispers of Alina Brooks, defiance spreading like wildfire. Every corner of the base carried the story now. A decorated SEAL commander had been neutralized in front of over 1,000 personnel, and the officer who did it had stood unflinching. But as inspiring as her actions were, the battle was far from over. Commander Trent Hale had retreated to his quarters, but his mind was a storm. Rage, humiliation, and wounded pride collided, sparking a dangerous resolve. This was no longer about protocol, it was personal. Hale had built his reputation on dominance, on fear, on control. And now, a single officer had undermined everything. Alina, meanwhile, remained calm on the surface. She had navigated the inquiry professionally, provided detailed statements, and maintained her composure. But beneath the calm exterior was a simmering awareness. She had made an enemy who would not forget this. Hale's retaliation could take many forms: subtle sabotage, political maneuvering, or even overt threats. And she knew that at Fort Harper, subtlety often went unnoticed until it was too late. The next morning began like any other, but the atmosphere was different. Soldiers whispered as she walked past, some nodding in respect, others casting wary glances. The ripple effect of the previous day's events was evident. Morale among the lower ranks had shifted subtly. Fear had been replaced with a quiet admiration for courage, a realization that integrity mattered more than intimidation. Hale, meanwhile, had begun his counteroffensive. Behind closed doors, he contacted influential officers and allies, planting seeds of doubt about Alina's judgment and capability. He framed the narrative carefully. She had acted rashly, endangered the chain of command, and humiliated a decorated SEAL. His words were laced with subtle threats, designed to manipulate perception without direct confrontation. Alina was not naive. She knew the subtle games Hale would play, the political chess moves meant to corner her, and she was ready. She had anticipated this escalation, studied every angle, every precedent, and every ally who might be swayed. But preparation didn't eliminate the tension. It merely allowed her to navigate it with precision. As the inquiry continued, new witnesses were brought forward. Some were sympathetic to Hale, hesitant to challenge a man with his reputation. Others, inspired by what they had seen, spoke in support of Alina, praising her restraint, skill, and adherence to protocol. The room became a battlefield of words, testimony, and silent power struggles, where truth and perception often collided. Hale's frustration grew. Each statement in Alina's favor, each piece of corroborating evidence, felt like a public defeat. His carefully constructed narrative was unraveling, and for the first time he realized that raw aggression alone would not suffice. He needed leverage, something more than intimidation. Late that afternoon, Alina received a confidential message from a fellow officer. "Hale is planning something. Be alert. He won't take this quietly." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her instincts told her that confrontation was imminent, and preparation was her greatest weapon. Every step she took, every decision she made, had to account for the invisible battlefield she now faced, a war of influence, perception, and subtle threats as lethal as any physical confrontation. By evening, the tension on the base had become palpable. Soldiers moved quietly, aware of the undercurrents between Alina and Hale. Rumors spread. Some feared retaliation, others admired her courage. Alina walked through the mess hall, nodding briefly to familiar faces, her expression neutral. Inside, however, her mind was alive with calculations. She knew that her actions had shifted the balance of power at Fort Harper, and Hale's response would be swift, calculated, and potentially dangerous. Later that night, Alina returned to her quarters to find a note slipped under her door. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Hale. You think you've won. You think your little display of skill and control makes you untouchable, but everyone has a limit, and you will see yours soon." She didn't flinch. She read the note carefully, noting the thinly veiled threat, the calculated attempt to intimidate. Her fingers brushed the edge of the paper, then she folded it deliberately and placed it in her desk drawer. This was not the first challenge she had faced, nor would it be the last. But the note confirmed her suspicions. Hale's retaliation had begun. Subtle, psychological, and strategic. It was designed to unsettle her, to create doubt, to make her second-guess every move. And she knew she had to respond, not with aggression but with precision, control, and foresight. The following morning brought the first tangible escalation. Orders were subtly adjusted, schedules manipulated, and assignments shifted in ways that appeared routine but were intended to isolate and undermine her authority. Alina noticed immediately. Her training allowed her to see patterns others missed, recognize intent in seemingly benign actions. Hale's fingerprints were everywhere, even if disguised. Alina moved with deliberate grace, countering each maneuver silently. She reinforced her commands, documented discrepancies, and quietly ensured that her influence among the soldiers remained intact. Every subtle attempt to destabilize her was met with a calm, strategic response. But the tension was growing. Soldiers whispered, some nervous, others quietly rooting for her. Hale's machinations were no longer just professional, they were personal, calculated to provoke fear, frustration, and mistakes. Every step Alina took had to be deliberate. One misstep could play directly into his hands. By midweek, the atmosphere at Fort Harper had become electric. Officers and soldiers alike sensed the invisible battle unfolding between the two leaders. Alina's every movement, Hale's every countermeasure, and the responses of the soldiers created a complex web of strategy, perception, and power. Late one night, as Alina reviewed her notes, her comm system buzzed with an alert. Unusual activity near the training grounds. Hale's indirect methods had escalated. This was no longer just subtle sabotage or psychological pressure. He was testing boundaries, probing for weaknesses, attempting to assert dominance in ways that didn't involve direct confrontation but carried risk nonetheless. Alina's eyes narrowed. Her mind raced, considering every variable, every potential outcome. She knew Hale would push further, that the inquiry, public perception, and the soldiers' loyalty were all pieces of the battlefield. She couldn't afford hesitation. And then, just as she prepared to respond, her comm crackled again. "Lieutenant Commander Brooks, you need to get to the training grounds immediately. Something happening now." Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from anticipation. Hale's retaliation had escalated beyond the office, beyond subtle manipulation, and was now manifesting as direct action. The soldiers, the base, and her own career hung in the balance. Every instinct screamed that this encounter would define the next chapter of Fort Harper's history. Alina grabbed her tactical jacket, moving with the same precision that had neutralized Hale on the parade ground. She didn't know exactly what awaited her, but she understood one thing clearly. The invisible battlefield had become real, and the confrontation was far from over. The night was dark, the air thick with anticipation. Somewhere on the training grounds, Hale was waiting, confident, dangerous, and unrelenting. And Alina Brooks, calm, calculated, and resolute, was about to meet him head-on once again. This time, in a contest where every second mattered and every move could tip the scales. The storm was far from over. Hale has escalated to subtle sabotage and psychological warfare. Alina recognizes the invisible battlefield, but is now called to confront direct action on the training grounds. The next part promises high-stakes confrontation, strategy, and risk. The training grounds at Fort Harper were eerily quiet, illuminated only by the harsh glare of floodlights that threw long, angular shadows across the asphalt and grass. The silence was deceptive. Soldiers had begun to gather at the edges, sensing something was about to erupt, an electric tension that made every heartbeat echo like a drum in the night. Lieutenant Commander Alina Brooks moved with purpose, her boots silent on the gravel. Every sense was alert. She had anticipated retaliation, but nothing could fully prepare her for the scale of what was coming. Hale was not a man accustomed to restraint, and his pride had been wounded beyond repair. Tonight, he would strike, not recklessly, but with the precision of someone used to controlling every outcome. From the shadows, Hale emerged, his figure imposing even under the artificial light. His uniform was disheveled, the sharp lines of his authority disrupted by the events of the past days. His eyes burned with intensity, a storm of anger, pride, and calculation. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, voice low, controlled, but edged with menace. "You forced my hand. I tried to maintain professionalism. I tried to let the system work, but you leave me no choice." Alina's expression remained neutral. Her hands rested lightly at her sides, fingers brushing the edge of her jacket where her tactical equipment was strapped. "Commander Hale," she said evenly, "I have done nothing but defend myself. Anything beyond that is your choice, not mine." Hale's lips twisted into a thin, hard line. "You've humiliated me in front of over 1,000 soldiers. You've embarrassed me before my peers. And now you continue to defy me. That ends tonight." The words hung in the air like a threat, and the soldiers around the perimeter instinctively drew in a breath. They knew, without question, that what was about to unfold was not mere posturing. This was a clash that could redefine authority, discipline, and respect at Fort Harper. Hale moved first, a sudden, sharp lunge intended to strike, intimidate, and assert dominance. Alina reacted instinctively. Years of combat, hand-to-hand training, and tactical awareness merged into one fluid motion. She sidestepped, used his momentum to her advantage, and redirected him off balance without striking unnecessarily. The impact of his stumble reverberated through the ground, a loud, sharp crack that made soldiers flinch. Hale's eyes blazed with fury, his pride stinging more than the physical disorientation. He had underestimated her again, and that realization only fueled his aggression. "You think this makes you untouchable?" he spat, voice rising. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Alina's response was calm, precise. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Commander, and I'm fully aware of my responsibilities." Hale lunged again, faster this time, aiming to corner her against the training wall. His movements were deliberate, a mixture of skill, raw aggression, and controlled rage. Alina pivoted, deflected, and countered, each move measured, precise, avoiding unnecessary harm but maintaining dominance over the encounter. The soldiers watching gasped collectively, their breath caught in their throats. Some instinctively reached for their radios, unsure whether to intervene. Others simply stared, captivated by the fluidity and intensity of the confrontation. It was unlike anything they had ever witnessed, a battle not just of strength, but of skill, experience, and sheer willpower. Hale's frustration mounted. Every failed attempt to dominate Alina physically chipped away at the image he had cultivated over years. He struck harder, faster, his moves less controlled, more desperate. Each motion betrayed the duality of a man trained for combat but blinded by ego. Alina adjusted seamlessly, anticipating his shifts, using his momentum against him. One move, one pivot, one precise redirection sent him stumbling back again, arms flailing, his balance faltering. He crashed to the ground, hard enough to echo across the field, yet Alina did not follow with aggression. She knew the optics, the protocol, and the importance of maintaining control. She had neutralized the threat. Hale scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily, sweat glistening on his forehead. The fury in his eyes had not diminished, it had intensified. "You've made a mistake," he growled. "I am not a man who forgives humiliation." Alina remained poised. Every muscle was coiled, ready to respond, yet restrained. "Then we are at an impasse, Commander," she said evenly. "I will not yield to aggression. I will not allow intimidation to dictate discipline." For a moment, the field was silent except for the heavy breaths of the two officers. The soldiers surrounding them watched, tense, realizing that the confrontation was more than a fight. It was a test of character, courage, and leadership. Hale's gaze flicked around, seeking validation, allies, or a way to regain control. But the soldiers were silent, observing, inspired by Alina's restraint and composure. He realized with a flash of raw anger that the battlefield had shifted. The crowd had become an audience, and she had already won the respect of those who mattered most, the men and women who served alongside them. Still, his pride would not allow him to back down. He lunged once more, a flurry of strikes designed to overwhelm. Alina pivoted, parried, and used a combination of redirection and leverage to send him sprawling again. Hale hit the ground hard, the sound echoing like a drumbeat across the training grounds. The soldiers erupted in quiet murmurs, unable to fully comprehend what they had just witnessed. One whispered, "She's incredible. He's never faced anyone like her." Hale's eyes blazed as he struggled to rise. The physical encounters were not the only battle. Every failed strike, every misstep, and every moment of being outmaneuvered was a psychological blow. Alina's calm, calculated control in the face of his aggression had dismantled his authority without a single act of excessive violence. For the first time, he hesitated. The weight of his humiliation, the realization that raw aggression alone could not dominate, pressed down on him. Alina recognized the subtle pause and seized it, not with violence but with presence. "You've lost control," she said softly, but every word carried the weight of authority. "You can threaten, intimidate, or strike, but none of it will succeed while discipline and integrity are upheld." Hale's chest heaved. His pride, wounded and battered, struggled to reconcile with the reality before him. He was a decorated SEAL, a man used to commanding fear and respect, but now he faced an officer who embodied precision, control, and unwavering courage. The soldiers held their breath, sensing the turning point. This was more than a clash of strength. It was a confrontation that tested the very essence of leadership and character. And then Hale made a subtle retreat, stepping back slightly, acknowledging for the first time that brute force was insufficient. The tension remained, but the immediate physical threat had passed. Alina stood her ground, eyes sharp, unyielding, the picture of composed authority. The soldiers around the perimeter erupted into quiet applause, cheers, and murmurs of admiration. The mood on the training grounds had shifted dramatically. Respect had been earned, courage had been displayed, and the balance of authority had been recalibrated. Yet Alina knew the battle was far from over. The inquiry loomed, Hale's wrath simmered, and the subtle war of influence and perception would continue. She had won this confrontation, but the storm was far from spent. As she turned to leave, the comms crackled again. "Lieutenant Commander Brooks, report to the General immediately. We have new developments." Her pulse quickened, not from fear but from anticipation. The confrontation at the training grounds had ended, but the aftermath, the inquiry, and the political storm were about to escalate further. Alina straightened, adjusted her uniform, and walked with deliberate purpose toward the command center, fully aware that every step, every decision, and every action would determine the next chapter of Fort Harper's history. The storm was not over. It had merely changed form. Elena has neutralized Hale physically and earned the respect of soldiers, but the inquiry, his simmering anger, and subtle political maneuvers are looming. Part 8 will resolve the confrontation, the fallout, and deliver a cinematic conclusion to the story. The command center at Fort Harper was alive with anticipation, the tension so thick it could almost be felt physically. Officers, witnesses, and administrators moved briskly, papers clutched tightly, while security personnel flanked every entrance. Cameras and recording devices captured every moment. The inquiry was about to reach its decisive stage. The air smelled faintly of polished wood, metal, and the subtle tang of adrenaline. Lieutenant Commander Elena Brooks entered, her uniform immaculate, her expression calm yet resolute. Every step echoed with authority and confidence. Over the past days, she had defended herself physically, navigated political subterfuge, and maintained the loyalty and respect of the soldiers under her command. Tonight, all those factors would converge in a single, pivotal moment. Commander Trent Hale sat across the table, his posture rigid, jaw clenched. He had spent the past days orchestrating subtle retaliations, planting doubts and leveraging connections, but nothing had undone the undeniable fact. His physical confrontation with Elena had failed. Every witness, every video, every statement reinforced her professionalism and his aggression. The general of the base, flanked by senior officers and the JAG legal team, opened the session. His voice was steady, commanding, but carried the weight of the moment. Today's inquiry is the culmination of a series of events unprecedented in the history of Fort Harper. We will hear statements, review evidence, and render judgment based on facts, protocol, and the integrity of our chain of command. Hale's eyes flashed, a spark of defiance and frustration. Elena's gaze met his steady, unwavering calm. She had prepared for this. Every word she would speak, every response was calculated to convey truth, discipline, and control. The first witness called was Sergeant Mitchell, who had been in the front row of the parade ground during the incident. His statement was precise, unwavering. Commander Hale struck Lieutenant Commander Brooks first, he testified. She did not retaliate aggressively. She defended herself according to training. His response was excessive, unprovoked, and publicly humiliating. A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. Hale's face hardened, but he could not interrupt. The evidence was mounting. Next came a junior officer who had been in the office during the first confrontation. She maintained composure, followed protocol, and neutralized a threat to her safety and the integrity of the formation, the officer stated. Her actions were controlled, professional, and precise. Video footage was then presented. Every angle captured Elena's defensive precision, Hale's aggressive lunges, and the reactions of the formation. The judges leaned forward, analyzing, scrutinizing every frame. The consensus was inescapable. Elena had acted appropriately, decisively, and professionally. Hale's attempts at subtle manipulation and character attacks crumbled under the weight of evidence. Each argument, each whispered suggestion, each note he had tried to plant as influence now appeared petty, desperate, and vindictive. When the general finally addressed the room, the tension reached its zenith. His voice was calm but carried unmistakable authority. "Commander Hale," he said slowly, deliberately, "your conduct over the past several days has violated both protocol and the principles expected of an officer of your rank. Physical aggression against another officer is unacceptable, regardless of prior service or rank. Further, your attempts at retaliation, influence, and intimidation have been noted and will be considered in evaluating your actions." Hale's jaw tightened, his face flushing with a mix of anger, frustration, and disbelief. For the first time, He realized that his years of dominance, intimidation, and authority were insufficient against integrity, skill, and unwavering professionalism. Turning to Alina, the general continued, "Lieutenant Commander Brooks, your actions were in accordance with training, protocol, and the principles of leadership. You defended yourself appropriately, maintained control of the situation, and upheld the integrity of the chain of command. Your composure, skill, and courage are exemplary. You have earned the respect of your peers, your subordinates, and this command." The room erupted, not in chaos but in quiet acknowledgement, nods, and murmurs of respect. Soldiers present straightened, some whispering to one another, others simply observing with awe. Alina's face remained composed, though a subtle relief passed through her eyes. She had defended herself, maintained her integrity, and now she had official recognition of her actions. Hale's eyes darkened, a storm of suppressed fury and realization simmering beneath the surface. He had been bested, not by physical strength alone, but by strategy, restraint, and courage. His authority had been challenged, his pride wounded, and his influence over the soldiers irrevocably altered. The general concluded the inquiry. "This session is adjourned. The findings are clear. Lieutenant Commander Brooks acted appropriately. Commander Hale's conduct will be addressed in accordance with military regulations, including disciplinary measures and counseling on professional conduct." Alina exhaled slightly, a controlled release of tension. She knew this was a victory, but it was also a reminder. Leadership carried both responsibility and risk. Her actions had inspired respect, but they had also placed her squarely in the crosshairs of those unwilling to accept accountability. Outside the inquiry room, soldiers gathered to hear the outcome. The moment Alina emerged, the mood shifted palpably. Cheers, applause, and expressions of admiration greeted her. She nodded subtly, acknowledging the recognition, but remained disciplined, aware that humility and control were as vital as courage and strength. Hale left the room shortly after, escorted quietly, his presence diminished. His reputation had suffered a blow that would take years to repair, and even then the shadow of his actions would linger. The soldier's perception had shifted irrevocably. Respect, once commanded through fear, now had to be earned through integrity, a lesson he had learned too late. Alina moved among the soldiers, listening, acknowledging, quietly inspiring. Conversations sparked around her, recounting the events, praising her skill, and reflecting on the courage it took to face a superior officer and maintain composure under pressure. Her actions had not only defended herself, but had reinforced the core values of leadership, discipline, and integrity for the entire base. Later that evening, Alina stood alone on the parade ground, the setting sun casting long shadows across the field. She reflected on the whirlwind of the past days, the confrontation, the inquiry, the subtle battles of influence and perception. Each moment had tested her resolve, her skill, and her character. But she had endured. She had defended herself without compromising protocol. She had inspired soldiers through action and example. And she had demonstrated a fundamental truth: courage, integrity, and professionalism could triumph over intimidation, ego, and aggression. A junior officer approached cautiously. "Ma'am, everyone is talking about what you did. You've changed how they see leadership here." Alina nodded, a faint, controlled smile crossing her lips. "Leadership is earned, not demanded," she said softly. "Respect isn't commanded by rank. It's earned through action, integrity, and courage. That's what matters." The officer nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. Soldiers nearby looked on, absorbing the lesson, inspired by her presence, and aware that the events of the past days would be remembered as a defining moment in Fort Harper's history. Alina turned toward the horizon, the last light of the sun glinting off her uniform. She had faced a superior officer, navigated a high-stakes inquiry, and maintained control in a situation that could have unraveled careers and reputations. She had done it with skill, composure, and unwavering courage. And as the shadows lengthened across the parade ground, one truth was undeniable. Lieutenant Commander Elena Brooks had earned not just respect, but admiration, loyalty, and a place in the history of Fort Harper that would not be forgotten. The storm had passed, but its lessons remained etched into the minds of every soldier who had witnessed it. Integrity, courage, and professionalism had prevailed, and the echoes of that victory would resonate for years to come. Elena's phone buzzed with messages from colleagues and soldiers alike. One simple text stood out. "We've got your back always." She smiled faintly, pocketing the phone. The battle had been won, but the responsibilities of leadership stretched ahead, vast and unending. Yet she was ready. She always was. The parade ground lay quiet once more, the echoes of courage, confrontation, and triumph lingering in the air. And as Elena Brooks gazed out at the soldiers, the horizon, and the fading light, she understood something deeply. True leadership was not about rank, medals, or intimidation. It was about integrity, action, and the courage to stand when others would falter. And in that moment, she stood taller than ever, the embodiment of strength, discipline, and unwavering resolve. Elena emerges victorious, physically, professionally, and morally. Hale faces the consequences of his actions. Soldiers are inspired, the base culture shifts, and the story concludes on a note of triumph, respect, and cinematic closure.